Good afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In continuation with the series on economic sociology, in today's lecture we are going to understand historical capitalism as concept which has been given by Immanuel Wallerstein. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein is trying to argue that capitalism has not evolved naturally or autonomously, but it can be traced through the origin in terms of the large scale economic, social and political changes taking place. And the core idea of the emergence of capitalism is the way in which the society and certain categories of individuals started accumulating wealth with the support of the political power and state. So, we try to understand that he is beginning to study capitalism by mentioning that capitalism is derived from the word capital. Historically, capital has referred to the accumulation of the efforts of past labor that haven't been used up. These past accumulations were only considered capital to the extent that they were used to accumulate more wealth. Capital came to be used with the primary intent of self-expansion. When capital accumulation is priority over the other objective, it is said to be a capitalist system. So, it is not only accumulating for consuming at that particular time, but it is accumulating with the objective to increase that accumulation in the future. So, it is going the only how will you increase the accumulation? By increasing the profit margin. So, when the priority is profit over other thing, it is said to be a capitalist system. And in order to kind of understand this idea of accumulation and expansion, he is critiquing the existing economics or the myth of the free market economic progress. And he says that capitalism does not lead to universal progress and development. It is not necessary that everywhere in every geographical space it will certainly lead to progress and development. So, many economic theories claim that capitalism benefits everyone by creating wealth. Wallerstein on the other hand claim that capitalism has generated inequality. Inequality not only in terms of creating the wage labor and institutionalizing the distinction between the poor and the rich, but it has also created a inequality between nations, the poor nations, the rich nations, the developed nations, the underdeveloped nations. So, basically he is critiquing the theory of free market and economic progress. Historical evidence according to Wallerstein shows that capitalism enriches a few while exploiting many. The periphery remains underdeveloped because the core extracts its wealth. Labor conditions often worsens under capitalism, and with capitalism we see new trends which is kind of sweatshop, low wage, the denial of the working, the right to collective bargaining and so on. So, basically the idea is to understand how capitalism evolved as a social system, and over the years it kind of led to exploitation, it has led to creating inequalities. And how do we understand the concept of capitalism? Wallerstein says that a key element in capitalism has two uses, one as its mere definition and another in the context of historical capitalism. According to its definition, it is merely described as accumulated wealth, but in historical system, capitalism was used in a special way with its primary objective or intent being self-expansion, which is to use capital in order to accumulate more of it. The accumulation is basically increasing, and every time it is kind of a more and more. And it was this goal of accumulating more capital which made the holder of the capital, who had to establish relations with others in order to achieve this goal, a capitalist. And since this goal was regularly a priority over other objective, it was said that the economic system was capitalist in nature. Although this was the goal of the capitalist, But in historical time, this was never an easy task to do so. The production process in historical time was known as the circuit of capital. This process included all the sub-processes needed to accumulate profit at the end. So, what are the sub-processes that goes into the accumulation and ultimately to the creation of capitalism? First, the producer had to find and hire appropriate kind and quantity of labor. He has to search for labor who would work for the capitalist. Secondly, once the goods were produced, they had to be marketed through a system of distribution. Thirdly, the producer had to find a group of buyers where they could purchase and sell the group. So, basically you have to find a market. So, fourthly, the producer had to set a price greater than the total cost with a margin of profit and save the profit until a reasonable opportunity occurred to invest it. And lastly, renew the whole process from production. Basically, it is saying that you repeat. So, you start for your search of labor, you distribute your product, you search for a market, find for sellers and buyers, and keep on increasing the profit margin until you have a reasonable amount to reinvest, and this invest and reinvest ultimately leads to the creation of a capitalist society. Since each production process of a particular good included a lot of sub-production process within it, it resulted in a complex commodity change. For instance, you need to produce a shirt, you would also need a sub-process that would kind of produce yarn or which could be kind of weaving those yarn. So, there are number of process and then sub process within it. So, it creates a commodity chain. But each of these items in turn have to be produced, and the items that go into the production in turns are also to be produced, and it kind of every commodity of every sub process is also commodified. That is means even the process is commodified and the product is commodified. So, basically the title commodification of everything, Wallerstein says that it is not only the production process, it is not only the kind of search for a market, but the product, the process and the labor all are commodified. So, in simple word, all these workers hold a share in the ultimate margin that exists in the commodity chain between the total cost of production and the total income received by the disposal of the final product. Once this point was clear, all the capitalists then focused on a single goal, which was to increase the rate of accumulation of the capital, which then created the competition in the capitalist market. Most of the capitalists tried to decrease the cost of production as a solution for increasing the rate of accumulation in order to survive in the market. Higher rewards went to those who had greater judgment, greater ability to control workforce and better access to politically decided constraint, basically the monopolies. Wallerstein observes that the economies of capitalism is governed by the rational intent to maximize accumulation. But what was the rational for entrepreneurs wasn't necessarily rational for workers. Wallerstein describes, therefore, that the capitalist system or capitalism had certain functioning. So, the functioning of the capitalist system basically implies that the system functioned by understanding the relationship between the producer and the notion of profit. So, the labor is nowhere, it is kind of the entire system functions only from the perspective of the producer. Since a producer's main objective is to increase accumulation of capital, its procedure would be to maximize sales of a given good as much as possible at the highest profit margin. But the producer can only do this while going through a series of economic constraints that exist in the market. And what are these objective constraints? These are all objective constraints, meaning they exist in the absence of any particular set of decision by giving a producer or by other active in the market. These constraints are the consequence of the total social process that exists in a concrete time and place. There are always in addition other constraints more open to manipulation. Firstly, for instance, government may adopt or may already have adopted various rules which in some way transforms economic options and therefore the calculus of profit. Then a given producer may be with the beneficiary or the victim of existing rules. Labor power, being the most significant element in the production process, is concerned with two different aspects. First, its availability, and second, its cost. Now, there are two different types of labor and both come with their own disadvantage. Social relations of productions that were fixed in the sense of a stable workforce for a given producer might be low cost if the market was stable and the size of his workforce optimal for a given time. So, they are kind of variable workforce in the system. But if the market for the product declined, the fact that the workforce was fixed would increase its real cost for the producer. And should the market for the product increase, the fact that workforce was fixed would make it impossible for the producer to take advantage of the profit opportunities. On the other hand, variable workforce also had disadvantages. Variable workforces were workforce that were not necessarily continuously working for the same producer. Such workers cost more than the fixed labor since they had to make enough to cover periods when they did not receive remuneration. Plus, they were less in quantity since most of the labor were fixed. Due to both the options, not suitable enough for producer causes a contradiction and results in a historically uneasy compromise. These considerations gave rise to the institution of wage labor, wherein a group of persons existed who were permanently available for employment more or less to the highest bidder. This process is referred as operation of labor market and the person who sell the labor as proletarians. The household has been the economic unit engaged in economic activity, with first seeking enough to survive, then with more income enjoying a lifestyle more satisfactory, and with still more capital entering into capitalist game to accumulate more of it. Within the household structure comes a social distinction between productive and unproductive work in the working class. So, who are these productive and unproductive work? Productive work came to be defined as money earning work, primarily wage earning work, and non-productive work that was merely subsistence activity and therefore was said to produce no surplus. Productive or wage labor became the task primarily of the adult male father and secondly of other younger adult males in the house. Non-productive, that is subsistence labor, became the task primarily of the adult female or mother and secondly of other female plus the children and the elderly. Productive labor was done outside the household in the workplace, while non-productive labor was done within the household. Although division of real labor by gender and age was not an invention of historical capitalism, what was new under historical capitalism was the correlation of division of labor and valuation of work. Under historical capitalism, there has been a steady devaluation of the work performed by women and heavy emphasis have been laid upon adults' male work. The male wage earner came to be termed as the breadwinner and the female home worker or the unproductive worker was labeled as housewife. This led to all breadwinners being considered as the only economically active labor force in national statistics, and thus was sexism institutionalized. And the concept of extended childhood and retirement are concomitant of the emerging household structures of historical capitalism. So, the division of labor was institutionalized, and these kind of institutionalization are viewed as progressive exemption from work. So, female, children, retired, old are kind of considered into the idea that they have been progressively left out from the workforce. Also, non-work is another term used to define their work. Another concept that comes into with the emergence of historical capitalism is proletarian household. Proletarian households are the ones with more wage worker, where most of the real income comes from wage work. Where a proletarian household depended primarily upon wage income, then that had to cover the minimal cost of survival and reproduction. However, when wages formed a less important segment of total household income, it would often be rational for an individual to accept employment at a rate of remuneration which contributed less than its. The semi-proletarian household these were what Wallerstein has termed as the semi-proletarian household, which led to a demise of a proletarian household. Recruitment from the non-wage workers permitted producers to remunerate the workforce at lower rates, thereby reducing their cost of production and increasing their profit margin. Hence, forcing any employer of wage labor to prefer wage worker located in semi-proletarian rather than proletarian household. And the third concept that comes in is the invisible hand concept. As per the invisible hand concept, there are certain actions in the market that are enacted by the individual in the goal of accumulating self-interest, but the consequences end up amplifying to benefit those in the proximity of time and space, particularly resulting in harmony. In a pattern repeated recurrently in half a century, disproportion of investment by increasing number of entrepreneurs linking themselves in different commodity chain led to, in what Wallerstein words, in misleading of overproduction. The clogging by accumulated capital without much of its displacement has done a shakedown of the productive system. This activity, which held massively in a series of operations, has eliminated many entrepreneurs and workers. Whatever the operations were, they enabled entrepreneurs to introduce themselves to innovation with which new links can be established to any commodity chain. This is because certain operations happening earlier within these chains were first demoted to make space for new link. So, Wallerstein, when we see this understanding of historical capitalism, we will try to understand that he begins with the idea that there was a whole idea of accumulation. So, the three distinction between the traditional historic social system and the historical capitalism is basically that earlier there was no accumulation. Accumulation was only for consumption. So, there was a subsistence economy, and then when we start kind of accumulating with the objective of accumulating. So, your capital is being invested not for only consumption, for also for saving and further investment. And then the third distinction is the idea that in traditional system many of the parts of the circular capital was considered as immoral or not allowed, and therefore the circuit was never complete. It had at any point the production, distribution or the search for market was at any point was kind of hindered. Whereas in the historical where we look into capitalism, the circuit of capital is complete and it kind of repeat, the circuit is repeating, that is they are producing, distributing, searching for market for sale and purchase, and then again kind of investing. This led to the consequence outcome of this is that when they are investing, they are searching a market for production, they look for workers who would produce for them at cheap. So, cheap labor becomes one of the essential feature of capitalism. Once they are kind of found the production process, they are distributing, and this distribution it kind of creates a further circuit of consumers and the market. So, everything is getting commodified, the production process, the sub process, the labor, the capital, and then because you are engaged in production, there will be idea of paying something to the workers. So, you cannot kind of have temporary workers, you wanted a permanent workers because there are certain shortfalls of having temporary workers, and when you kind of depend on these permanent workers, you have to compensate them wage. Now, the wage was given to workers who were working in the public space, in the factory, in the offices, and as such most of the productive processes were done by men. So, there was a distinction between the productive work and the unproductive work, and from this emerged the distinction between the productive work being done outside the house and unproductive being done within the house. So, the productive were men doing this work, so they were labeled as breadwinner. Now, larger valuation, or since they were kind of generating economy, they were part of the accumulation process, they were kind of considered as superior compared to the non-productive workers who were basically by and large women, who then became dependent on the breadwinners. And this dichotomy was created, or what has been termed in economy as sexual division of labor gets institutionalized, sexism gets institutionalized, and here therefore the kind of leads to a devaluation of the work. So, the Wallenstein key insight is that capitalism is not a permanent system. It arose under specific historical conditions, and like all system before, it will eventually be replaced. Capitalism depends on expansion, but global limits are emerging and economic crisis and inequality are increasingly being part of the world's of the globe. Social and political resistance suggest a growing rejections of capitalism. So, we see all over in different parts of the globe that there is an increase in the protest movement, there is increase in the resistance. So, this resistance is against capitalist, this resistance is against the whole idea to kind of create a system which would be alternate to. So, most of the time in many social sciences, the argument is that capitalism survived because it did not have a competitor, and now that we kind of are trying to understand that post capitalist society, we are turning back to what we had. So, it is not always progressive and it is not always based on the idea of development. Much of the argument is that just as feudalism collapsed, capitalism may also evolve into something new. So, this crisis, the resistance, the protest are all suggesting that there is a search for an alternate world system which would kind of do away with the inequality, which would do away with the crisis which is being faced in terms of the social crisis, political crisis and environmental crisis. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.